Okay, welcome. This is chapter 29 in Wheelocks. We're going to be looking at the imperfect subjunctive. We introduced subjunctive last week in the form of present tense. Today we're going to be adding the imperfect tense, as well as looking at the subjunctive forms for the irregular verbs sum and possum. But we'll be looking at both present and imperfect for both of those irregular verbs. And then last week we added purpose clause. We looked at the uses of subjunctive mood. Specifically, we looked at the jussive, or jussive rather, jussive, hortatory, jussive, as well as the purpose clause. But today we'll be looking and adding the result clause. So let me go ahead and share my screen with you guys. And let's see if we can't get us going here. Let's go ahead and move this up and out of the way. All right, let's hit play here. All right, so here it is, chapter 29. Let's take a look at this. If you remember, we looked at the characteristics of verbs. Last week we reviewed them. We've learned these over the last couple of years: voice, active and passive, mood, indicative, imperative, all six tenses: present, imperfect, future, perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect. We've learned person, first, second, and third, as well as number, singular, and plural. And then last week we introduced a new mood. It was the subjunctive mood. And we looked at, again, a couple of different uses of subjunctive. The first one was the jussive or hortatory jussive, which is when it's used as an independent or main verb, independent clause, main verb. In a sentence, we translate it as like let us or let them do their homework or let them go. It's a command for basically first and third persons, and generally command for second person is used, conveyed by the imperative mood. So we looked at that as well as the purpose clause. So let's take a look. This is a reminder of what indicative mood is. It's the mood that points things out, real action, has or has not happened. Imperative mood is the command, as I just said a minute ago, generally for second person. And then the subjunctive mood is the mood of potential, tentative, hypothetical, ideal, or unreal action. In the English, we use some auxiliary words like may or might, should, would, could, may have, would have, etc. to help convey this idea. Latin, however, does something a little different. It has a special form for the subjunctive mood. And we use, well, the form takes a vowel shift in the stem vowel of the main verb, or the main principal part there. So it shifts from whatever the main vowel is to a new vowel. And we use a mnemonic device to help us remember this shift. We use he beat a giant. So your book says we fear a liar, but I like he beat a giant better. And so our vowel is simply going to shift to this new vowel. Let's take a look in the indicative, of course, first conjugation verbs. Like laudo had a long A, monao, second conjugation, had a long E, ago had a short E, third conjugation verbs, and then, of course, fourth and third IO have a long I. But we're going to shift to an E, an EA, an A, and an IA, respectively. And here's what it looks like. Lauda becomes laude, monet becomes monea, aga becomes aga, and audi and capi become audia and capia. So he beat a giant. And so we just took this vowel shift and added our endings, mst, mustus, int, and this is how we form the subjunctive in the present tense, okay? And there again, there's that mnemonic device. So here's what we're gonna do for the imperfect tense in the subjunctive mood. I'm gonna do active and passive voice. And this is really the simplest subjunctive to form. I really love it. You simply take the second principal part, which is the infinitive, and you add your endings, mst, mustus, int. So it's laudarem, laudares, laudaret, laudaremus, laudaretus, laudarent. It's pretty easy. And then in the passive voice, you simply add your aris, ter, mer, mini, inter. And so you come away with laudarer, laudaroris, it's hard to say, laudareter, laudarer mer, laudarer mini, laudarenter. There you go. It's almost hard to say. But that's how you form the passive. It's just the infinitive plus the passive endings. And I'll quickly run through the second and third, etc. conjugations. Here's the active voice for monere. You just add your endings, mst, mustus, int. And for passive, Again, you just simply add your aorist term, mer, many, inter. Third conjugation paradigm verb, I go, ageri. You take your ageri, you add your endings, mst, must, descent. For the passive, again, infinitive plus your passive endings. Aorist term, mer, many, inter. For fourth conjugation and third IO rather, you have your adiri, mst, must, descent. Passive, aorist term, mer, many, inter, added to the adiri, the second principal part here, the infinitive. It's pretty simple. And then, of course, your third conjugation paradigm verb, capere. You got your capere plus your MST, must, descent, in the active voice. And for the passive, to your capere, you add your aorist term, mer, many, inter. It's pretty simple. I love subjunctive imperfect. And it's really easy to see. You see an infinitive plus endings. It's really pretty straightforward that this is the subjunctive imperfect, either active or passive, depending on the ending that you have. So that's pretty cool here. I'm going to introduce to you, however, new right now, your sum and possum in the subjunctive mood. These are irregular verbs. You learned them a long time ago. I'll remind you what it looks like in the indicative mood. In the active voice here, here it is. Sum esse fui futurum. And if you remember the present tense, it's simply sum ss, sum esse sunt. And the imperfect was arama rasarat, arama sarata sarant. And for possum, you're just going to basically add a POS or POT to this present tense form. It's possum, possi, potui. And you end up with possum, potest, potest, possumus, potestus, possunt, and poteram, poteras, poterat, poteramus, poteratus, poterant in the imperfect. So those you've already learned: active voice, irregular, indicative mood. We're going to introduce to you now the subjunctive mood for these irregular verbs. And here's what it looks like. It's a new form in the present tense for sum, but it's really easy. It's sim, sis, sit, simus, situs, sint. I like that one. Sim, sis, sit, simus, situs, sint. Say it out loud. Sim, sis, sit, simus, situs, sint. Say it 5 times. Sim, sis, sit, simus, situs, sint. 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 Sim, sis, sit, sim, sis, sit, simus, situs, sint. It's kind of hard to say, but just memorize that. It's a pretty cool form, and it's easy to do. Imperfect in the subjunctive uses the same format as what we just learned a few minutes ago on how to do subjunctive imperfect. You take the infinitive, the second principal part, here it's SA, and you add your endings, MST, must, descent, and you end up with SM, assess, asset, assemus, assetus, assent. So that is the standard form for forming the subjunctive imperfect. And then possum, we're just going to add a POS to the sim, sis, sit, right? And we end up with possum, possis, possit, possimus, possitus, possint. Pretty easy. And then again, your subjunctive imperfect, you take the infinitive, here it's posse, and you add your endings, MST, must, descent, and you end up with possem, possess, posset, possemus, possetus, possent. And so these are the irregular form verbs, sum and possum, in the subjunctive mood. So work on this. I'm going to go ahead and stop this video. I'll do a second video for the second part. Go ahead and read your text on page 236 and 237, and just read through that and work on your homework for this tonight. We'll see you on the next video. All right, this is an amendment to my previous video. I'm going to add this to the back end of yesterday's video. I realized this morning that I had forgotten just a quick something on how to properly translate the imperfect subjunctive. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you and pull this up. And let me put this into share mode. Here we go, play. So we talked about yesterday how to form the subjunctive. And basically the subjunctive imperfect, and it's just taking the infinitive, second principal part, and then adding either your active endings, MST, must, descent, or your passive endings, aorist, ter, mer, many, inter. So that's how you form them, but I didn't really talk specifically about how to translate them necessarily. I jumped right into the result clause and review of the purpose clause from last week. So let me specifically address the translation of the imperfect subjunctive. So the purpose clause, let's see here. The purpose clause is what we learned last week. And the purpose clause basically makes use of the subjunctive in a dependent clause. You got the main sentence or the main verb, main action, and then you've got a dependent clause added to it. So you're gonna have a subjunctive verb in that secondary clause. And if it's introduced by ut, and if it is telling you, if it's answering the question why something was done, it's a purpose clause. And when you have a present tense main verb, in this case, dixit, then you will always have a present tense infinitive. And you can see here, a present tense subjunctive. And you can see here the uvet, I-U-V-E-T, yvette, is the present tense subjunctive. And so when you translate this, we gave you several ways to translate it last week. So this is directly taken from last week. You can say he says, dixit, he says, hoc this, ut to, uet, to help them. And so simply the uvet, I'm trying to pronounce that V, that W sound there, is simply translated like an infinitive here, present tense. And so he says this to help them, but you could also say it like this. He says this in order to help them. He says this that he may help them. He says this so that he may help them. He says this in order that he may help them. All of those are proper translations, but notice this in those the third, fourth, fifth option here, the use of the word may. If you have a present tense subjunctive, one way you can translate it in a purpose clause is with the word may. He may help them, that he may help them. Okay, now compare this to what we're talking about this week, the imperfect tense. Here you have a very similar sentence, but notice the main verb has changed from dicit, present tense, to dixit, perfect tense. Hoc dixit ut et os iwaret. So not only is the main verb in the perfect tense, you have the subjunctive in a past tense. It's the imperfect tense. I-U-V-A-R-E-T, ueret, is the infinitive plus ending. So you know it's the imperfect form of the subjunctive. And so notice how this is translated. He said, dixit, he said this, hoc, he said this, to help them. You could also translate it in order to help them. He said this that he might help them. He said this that he might help, so that he might help them. He said this in order that he might help them. All of these, just like the top section, are options, a way to translate this, just a little bit different. But notice the difference here on the top section, because it's present tense subjunctive, you use the word may, and in the bottom section, you used might for the imperfect subjunctive. So I want to point this out here, that if the main verb is present tense, you're going to have present subjunctive. Present subjunctive will always be used with present main verb. And then the imperfect subjunctive will always be used with the past tense main verb. So that's a correlation you'll want to keep in mind. And if it's in the main, if it's in the present tense, you use the subjunctive, you translate it may. And if it's the imperfect subjunctive, you would translate it might. And all of this is true for the purpose clause. It will not be true for the result clause, which is something we talk about also this week. So please note that. I want to show you this last slide here. This is important. The key to translation of subjunctive. These are three things you need to know. You need to know the definition of the type of clause. You need to know what kind of clause it is and know the definition. So right now this week, as of this week, you've learned the jussive or hortatory subjunctive. You've learned the purpose clause and also now the result clause. You need to know the definition of these, and you need to know how to recognize each of these types of clause. So if you remember, the jussive or hortatory subjunctive was simply that you have a subjunctive as the main verb, and then you translate it let, right? Let us, let them, whatever the verb is. In the purpose clause, how you recognize it is that you have ut, introducing a subjunctive clause, ut plus subjunctive, right? And then, or ne if it's negative. And then in the result clause, which you're going to get to here after you watch this video, tomorrow's video, a result clause is basically the same thing as a purpose. introduced, ut introduces a subjunctive clause, but it's going to have an adverb or an adjective that goes with it, and I'll save that for tomorrow. But you got to learn each of these, how to recognize each of these clauses. And the last thing is you have to know how to properly translate the subjunctive verb in each of these types of clauses. So how you translated imperfect subjunctive in the purpose clause is going to look different than how you translate the imperfect subjunctive in the result clause. So you have to know how to translate it properly for each clause. So definition, recognition, proper translation. Those are the keys to translating subjunctive. So just want to add that to the back end of this video, and we'll see you tomorrow.